Good morning and welcome to the Miller Center. It's an honor to do the introduction to today's event, The Past and Future of NATO, which is a conversation about history, but at a very relevant moment. Today we're 4 years into the war in Ukraine, and the history of NATO and NATO enlargement couldn't be more relevant than in the current moment. And we've got a terrific group together to discuss that history. Today's discussion is inspired by Stephan Kieninger's new book, Securing the Peace in Europe, Strobe Talbott, NATO, and Russia After the Cold War, which revisits the strategic choices that shaped European security through the eyes of a central diplomat in that effort, Strobe Talbott, who was Deputy Secretary of State for much of that period. I think it's fair to say that Stephan's book makes the case that Strobe was not just a central figure in the Clinton administration, but perhaps the central figure other than President Clinton himself. About what to do with the former Soviet Union and the power vacuum in the center of Europe, Strobe's role was quite important. Now, you should know I'm obviously biased in this. I worked with Strobe for 10 years at the Brookings Institution, and before that, for some time in government, but I'm only one of many, many acolytes that Strobe Talbott had, and today we have assembled several of them. Strobe's impact was far and wide. It cut across not just Europe and into Russia, but into South Asia, South America, and even parts of East Asia. And what we'll get today is a sense of not just the big strategic security issues, but the role that an important diplomat can play in those. So with that, let me introduce this panel and then turn it over to our moderator to get the conversation going. Stephan Kieninger, who's written this new book, which is available for sale afterwards for those here with us today, is a historian and non-resident fellow at the American-German Institute. He's held fellowships at the Woodrow Wilson Center and Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and is the author of this book, Securing the Peace in Europe, which uses previously untapped archival material, including from Strobe, including personal correspondence that Strobe had, as well as his own detailed notes of this entire period. It is a terrific read, and I really recommend it to everyone. We also have Ambassador Victoria Newland, who is a senior advisor at Covington and Burling, and the Shelby Cullum Davis Professor at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. She's a retired career Foreign Service officer, an ambassador and diplomat, serving in senior roles across 6 administrations, including as Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs and Acting Deputy Secretary of State. And she served as Strobe Talbott's Chief of Staff when he was Deputy Secretary of State, and gave me one of my first tutorials in how to work at the State Department. Stephen Stefanovich is the George F. Kennan Senior Fellow for Russian and Eurasian Studies, Council on Foreign Relations, and as Professor Emeritus at Columbia University, SIPA. He served in senior U.S. government roles on Russian policy and is the author of influential works on American foreign policy. And moderating today's conversation is my other State Department mentor, along with Jim Steinberg and Strobe, obviously, Eric Edelman, a Miller Center practitioner senior fellow, retired career minister from the U.S. Foreign Service, who has served as ambassador in Finland and later in Turkey, and senior positions both at the State Department and the Department of Defense. Eric also served as our Schlesinger professor here. You should all know that though Eric is a mentor, I did not recruit him for that. I see Mel Leffler in the audience. Mel and other faculty members helped recruit Eric to that position just as I was coming on. So we're grateful to all of them and to all of you for joining us in this important conversation. And I turn it over to Eric to moderate.
Thank you, Bill. It is really an honor and a pleasure to be here this morning to moderate this conversation. And normally when a moderator says that, it's just a sort of routine pleasantry, but in this case, I actually mean it. And that's for a couple of reasons. First, because I think this will give us an opportunity to recognize Strobe's really incredible role in the making of American national security policy, which I think has perhaps not received as much attention as it ought to, and I think Stephan's book helps remedy that. And I say that because, and I don't want to speak for Steve and Toria, two of my favorite colleagues from my service in government, but I think they'll agree, Strobe was just a terrific boss as a human being. He was kind and generous, qualities not all that common in Washington. He was intellectually curious. He was respectful of subject matter expertise and bureaucratic experience, but at the same time, always looking to push the envelope for what was in the art of the possible diplomatically. And that, I think, made him both, a good but sometimes challenging boss to work for. So with that as an introduction, let me turn, Stephan, first to you and ask you to talk a little bit about how you came to write this book, and maybe describe a little bit some of the new archival sources that you were able to tap, and in that way help put Strobe into context in the Clinton presidency.
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. First of all, there's Strobe's centrality to the whole foreign policy making process in the Clinton years. Strobe was literally everywhere. He was in charge of various subjects across issue areas, and he left a tremendous amount of archival materials, some of which have been recently declassified. For instance, the State Department put several thousands of his documents online in their State Department's Freedom of Information Act reading room. So you can all go there, foyastate.gov, type in Talbott, and you get about 5,000 hits or so. That's a lot of materials, but great materials. His transcripts of conversations with Russian interlocutors, with Yevgeny Primakov, Andrei Kozyrev, and his Russian counterpart, Georgy Mamedov, Russia's deputy foreign minister. It's all there. And then, of course, there's a subset of materials with notes to Toria, Steve, Eric.
Usually on a napkin, illegible.
Yeah, and that it shows the way he operates, right? So he gets up at 4 a.m. and he writes instructions or notes for his colleagues and co-workers. So an enormous amount of discipline and intellectual curiosity, and that's Strobe, and I wrote it because it's fascinating for me, and I wanted to use his perspective as a prism to investigate post-Cold War history, because I thought it's such a promising way to approach it, because he worked on so many issues: NATO enlargement, NATO Russia, Ukraine, Baltics, Balkans, Haiti, India, Pakistan, and that's not even India. Pakistan is not even part of the book, so that's why I wrote this, to put some of the pieces together.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit, Stephan, about the Bill and Boris relationship. Some years ago, in this very room at a conference that Mel Leffler and Jeff LeGros organized, which became a book, Walt Slocum, my predecessor as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, several times removed, wrote an essay and presented it here, suggesting that the Bill and Boris relationship was the strategy of the Clinton administration. Strobe, I think, was central to that relationship. In his own memoir, The Russia Hand, he makes the suggestion that it really was Bill Clinton who was the Russia hand, not Strobe. But I think that might be maybe a little too modest on Strobe's part. How do you see that?
Yep, exactly. It was a bit too modest on Strobe's part. I mean, Bill Clinton was the central political driver of that relationship and of that engagement with Boris Yeltsin, but Strobe was in charge of institutionalizing it, the day-to-day steward of that relationship and the manager of it, and So it was a good combination, I think, of Bill Clinton's political instincts and Strobe's capacity to put it all together and to frame it into a coherent strategy and to manage it in times of crisis also. And when we look back, we take it for granted, these 18 meetings between Bill Clinton and Boris Yeltsin, but at the outset it was, as you know, it was very much contested at the outset, whether to have that first Vancouver summit in April 1993 or not. Strobe was in favor of it, but there were others who were more skeptical, like including Warren Christopher or Tony Lake. They were more hesitant to have this engagement. So, but it was Strobe said it was the essential flywheel, as he put it, in the relationship.
I hope during the course of the conversation we can touch on the negotiation of the Budapest Memorandum, which had to do with Ukraine giving up claims to the nuclear weapons left on Ukrainian territory after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, on the diplomacy of NATO enlargement, and then the diplomacy around the Bosnia and Kosovo wars. But I want to get to our other two panelists, and so hopefully we'll all come back to that. Toria, you worked for Strobe almost continuously for the entire 8 years of the Clinton administration, save for 2 brief periods of maternity leave. Talk a little bit about what it was like working for Strobe and how much your personal experience, squares with what you read in Stephan's book.
Well, first of all, remember Strobe came to government as having been Time magazine correspondent. So he had traveled with presidents, he'd traveled with secretaries of state for 15 years and sort of watched it from the outside. But he quickly discovered that doing it was a completely different thing. Of course, his huge advantage was that he had this incredible relationship with Bill Clinton, which was really a relationship. I remember the first time when I came back from Moscow to work for him that Bill Clinton called him. Clinton was a night owl, and Strobe was definitely not. Strobe got up at 4 o'clock in the morning to write, and Clinton would call Strobe well after Strobe was dead asleep and, have a long conversation. And the first time it happened, Strobe walked in the next morning, threw a notebook on my desk and said, "I think there are notes from a conversation with Bill Clinton here. Can you see if you can decipher them?" Because he couldn't even remember what had happened because he had been dead asleep. But what it meant was that he had that channel, he had that ability, and Clinton was hugely interested because, of course, things were changing so quickly on the ground. So they talked regularly, much to the occasional chagrin of the bosses in between who had to catch up. But Strobe also had this, of course, amazing facility with language and with words. So we would, after any major encounter that we would do on anything, he would write a 1.5, 2-page, handwritten, tight, fun piece of paper about what had happened, what the strategic implications were, and where we should go going forward, which he would nominally send to Warren Christopher, who he was also close with, but it would obviously end up in Bill Clinton's hands, and therefore he could sort of control but also influence the narrative all the way up the vertical. And then the last thing I would say that I learned from him and practiced for the rest of my time in diplomacy, he had this instinct, and from the very beginning he decided that he needed a small interagency team. It wasn't enough to work just White House and state. And so whenever we traveled on the small G5 plane, we always had state defense, we had a defense senior civilian, we had a defense uniform, we had treasury, and we sometimes had commerce with us as well. So inside that little plane was an interagency team that was preparing meetings, that was analyzing meetings on the back end, that came home and tried to sell the outcome and the proposals we were making through the interagency. And it was both exciting, bonding, we all got smarter from it, but it also was effective as an interagency process, and I learned a huge amount. And later, when I was principal on negotiations, I always did the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you mentioned that because it's something I neglected to mention in my introduction, and you're right that I think the interagency dimension of this, keeping the normal kind of bureaucratic tensions down to a dull roar was actually one of his major accomplishments. I want to come back to all three of you, actually, on one of the criticisms of Strobe's diplomacy, which was that it was too Russia-centric. But before we get to that, I want to bring Steve in. Steve, the decision to enlarge NATO was largely made by President Clinton in the summer of 1996, at the tail end of the first term. You had been a critic going into that period of the idea of NATO enlargement, and yet Strobe recruited you in 1997 to come into the administration to take up the role he had played as ambassador at large for the new independent states, essentially the assistant secretary for the former Soviet Union. Can you talk a little bit about the reasons for your skepticism about NATO enlargement, your views changed or not changed over time about that? Because of course it's such a moment of controversy right now.
I will do that, but first I have to say that everyone should read Stephan's book, which is an excellent piece of work. And secondly, I have to correct something that Toria said.
Already, we're starting already.
She said Strobe would often do something indecipherable on a napkin. This is not true. One of the things I learned from Strobe early on is that he carried note cards in his breast pocket of his shirt, and in the course of a meeting you would get a series of these giving you interim instructions on his policy conclusions from the discussion so far, and what do you think of that?
And but then when he ran out of cards, he'd go to the napkin. Which was often.
I never saw the man run out of cards. But this shaped my own habits. And I am never without note cards. Eric, I'm glad you raised this question because it allows me to pivot a little bit from what I think is a very personal focus to a strategic one. The Bill and Boris relationship kind of was seen at the time as a kind of emblem of an over-personalized policy. But in fact, the priority of Russia at that moment was something actually quite widely shared. The idea that after the Cold War, you had to figure out a way to integrate Russia into a different world that was not just the Cold War II. That was the policy problem of American strategy in the world. And dealing with it did open you to questions of being too deferential to Russia, which is what people meant when they talked about Strobe being too Russia-centric. They also meant he was too interested in Russian literature. There's a class of Sovietologists who came to their interest in Russia by way of music and literature. Condi Rice is another example. The question was, really, did that involve a disposition to be too accepting of Russian conceptions of what their place in the world should be, or whether we could make them accept our view of integration. And my problems with NATO enlargement, which I wrote against over the course of the first Clinton administration, had to do with a sense that we were not keeping our eye on this central problem, which is, for the structure of the post-Cold War world, we needed to get the Russia relationship right. And my thought was that being too focused on NATO enlargement, we weren't really addressing the question of what our relationship with Russia was going to be. By the second term, I thought that had been kind of, well addressed, and the NATO-Russia Founding Act created a framework but it was only part of a framework for institutionalizing a new relationship with Russia. That did not mean one that gave the Russians what they wanted. Our idea was, and I think Strobe's idea was, get the Russians to buy what we wanted. That's what diplomats do. It's not, accepting the other guy's point of view. It's getting them to buy yours. And I thought, all in all, Strobe's approach to that was pretty good. Now, I will confess to you that I think he probably liked the idea that he was bringing into the administration in the second term somebody who'd been pounding the drum against NATO enlargement, because that meant there was somebody who would say the things that he had kind of learned not to say. Probably he was disappointed in this respect because, to deal with the Russians over any extended period of time is to develop a kind of irritation with their approach. And I see both Eric and Tori
Nodding.
It is not, they're not just nodding; they're sighing wearily. But
I don't think he'd mind my telling this story, but I was sitting with Bob Gates at a meeting of the 2+2, the foreign and defense ministers, with Condi Rice and Bob Gates, and he passed me a note saying, after being here for 2 hours, it reminds me how much I hated these people.
Well, no, but I do want to leave us with this thought, which is that, Russia hand, who was the Russia hand? The strategy was actually a kind of administration-wide approach to finding a new framework for European security in which the Russians would not play the destructive role that they had in the past. And I think Strobe was very solution-oriented in that respect. You would not know that this was a Russian literature major who had gained control of this portfolio.
And he put huge time into nurturing the alliance while he was doing this. I mean, we stopped almost always in Brussels.
And, and Strobe actually had a real susceptibility of extra fondness, which people who said he was Russia-centric didn't understand, for the leaders on the periphery of the former Soviet Union. So he would stop in Estonia and talk to Leonard Mary, and he would come back with all of the Estonian complaints about Russian imperialism, and we would have to sort of say, now hold on, we're not letting Leonard Mary shape our foreign policy. He was very, very tight with Georgians as well. I mean, this was...
Solana.
Exactly. This was somebody whose Russia-centrism did not keep him from understanding the way in which the other perspectives of governments across Europe had to be part of this new framework for European security.
Yeah, I mean, one of the Russia-centrism charges retrospectively now applied with regard to Ukraine is that the Clinton administration denuded Ukraine of its nuclear weapons capability. Stephan, you write about this, and Toria, you were involved, as was I, in some of the diplomacy here. I think it's important for people to understand that, first of all, the Ukrainians did not have any operational control of these weapons. They were all under the control of the strategic rocket forces of the former Soviet Union, headquartered in Moscow. Moreover, maintaining these things was going to cost a lot of money that Ukraine did not really have. And so the idea that they actually had a nuclear weapons capability, were going to be able to maintain it. There were also issues about some of these weapons were not exactly weapons that you could easily orient to target Russia either, for that matter, because they were intercontinental ballistic missiles. And Stephan, could you talk a little bit about the diplomacy that led to the Budapest Accord? And then Tori and Steve, if you want to comment, please do.
Yeah, I mean, Ukraine was a key priority for Strobe. I mean, when he entered office in '93, there was Russia, its constitutional crisis, there was Bosnia, there was Ukraine, and only then came NATO enlargement. So Ukraine was very high on his agenda, because Ukraine had inherited the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world, and the challenge was to get rid of these weapons in Ukraine and to provide Ukraine security assurances, political assurances. It was not legally binding assurances. And Strobe, to a large extent, negotiated that with his Russian counterpart Georgy Mamedov and Boris Tarasyuk, the Ukrainian deputy foreign minister at the time. It was contentious. It was contested. But as Eric said, it would have costed the Ukrainians about $3 billion to sort of maintain that arsenal, and they did not have operational control over that. So the best solution was for them to abandon it and to get these security assurances, which were violated by Russia, of course, in 2022, because there was no enforcing mechanism.
2014.
In 2014, actually, right? So there was no enforcing mechanism for the other guaranteeing powers to intervene than for the US and the UK. So it was seen as a non-proliferation problem at the time in 1994, but it also had broader implications, of course, for European security. It was a test case. Can Russia and Ukraine actually cooperate at the time in 94? And the Ukrainians, I was speaking with Boris Tarasyuk, he interviewed him, and they were really reluctant to abandon their arsenal because they had grave concerns about Russia's revisionism, of course, at the time. But they knew what they were doing because they had a Boris Yeltsin as a Russian president. But they were always scared about Yeltsin's successors at the time, and that was very high on their agenda, of course. And so it's maybe Toria, you can.
I just make one point, and Tori and Steve, you might want to comment on it, which is, Stephan just said that this was a non-proliferation problem. And I think for the audience, it's important to know that the Bush 41 administration had already signed an agreement with 4 of the post-Soviet states at Lisbon in 1992, which said there will only be one successor state as a nuclear weapons state under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It was Jim Baker who negotiated that, and it was Russia. And so Belarus and Kazakhstan, which also had nuclear weapons on their respective territories, were also gave up their claim to those weapons. What sometimes is lost in the shuffle is that there was going to be upcoming a RevCon, review conference of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was meant to make the Non-Proliferation Treaty a permanent treaty, not one renewed every 5 years. And the potential danger here was if you all of a sudden had a new nuclear weapons state with a rather large arsenal on its territory, the ability to renew the treaty and make it a permanent treaty would be endangered. And I would argue, if you look back at the history of arms control, the Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1998, which Steve knows a little bit about, having written his PhD dissertation on it, is probably one of the most successful, if not the most successful, artifact of the entire arms control era. So anyway, I did invite comment.
So just to roll it back even further, I was on the ground as a baby political officer at Embassy Moscow when Gorbachev gets captured by the coup guys. And I remember waiting 18 hours for Brent Scowcroft and Bush 41 to decide whether they were going to be on the side of the coup plotters or Gorbachev, because what they were concerned about most as they saw the potential for the Soviet Union to disintegrate, and they didn't want that, was the fear of proliferation, that the weapons would end up everywhere, which is why one of the final acts for Bush was getting this agreement that there'd be only one successor state. Ukrainians did not like it, some of them didn't like it, but frankly, the Russians at that time and this was part of Yeltsin also getting control of the security services and the army, were threatening that they would go down and grab these installations anyway if the Ukrainians didn't implement the withdrawal. And then the other piece of Budapest was that the Ukrainians wanted independent nuclear power. So we did this whole complicated dance where we swapped out the high enriched uranium for low enriched uranium, and they were able to be autonomous on the economic side. But at the time, it was not, we certainly wouldn't have had any chance of knitting Russia into the larger world that we had built, which was the strategy, if they had been confronting an armed Ukraine. And nobody knew who the Ukrainians were going to be either at that time. They were kind of all over the map. But when you look back on it now, you do have to say, did we think through all of the strategic implications? Did we make enough belt and suspenders for the Ukrainians in particular? Probably not.
Let me just add one thing to that, Eric. Because Ukrainians, I've heard this so often from Ukrainian friends since the war started.
Yeah.
You know, the idea that they made a big mistake at Budapest in 1994. And I tell them I think that's wrong, because you would have chosen then to have a crisis in your relations with the United States, which would have permanently damaged the opportunity that Ukraine had to be to itself buy into the American strategy for a framework for European security. And that would have been an immensely costly decision. It would have made the Russians seem like good guys.
Yeah.
And that was not, no Ukrainian strategy since 1991 could ever have been justified that made the Russians the good guys and them the problem for the United States. So I tell Ukrainians, you did the right thing.
We've got about 10 minutes or so before I want to turn over the microphone to our audience for Q's and A's, both the audience here in the room and also online. I do want to, though, before we get there, maybe just quickly touch on the diplomacy of the war in Kosovo. I mean, Strobe was very involved in the war in Bosnia as well, although largely that was the late Richard Holbrooke's work, although Strobe had no small part in aiding Holbrooke.
The part that Strobe did was knitting the Russians into the solution and getting them to be part of the peacekeeping operation. They took NATO command and control, which seemed impossible. Of course, it didn't last through Kosovo, but sorry, Eric.
Yeah, well, but in the Kosovo piece, though, was really, I think, has been undervalued, although the late Martti Ahtisaari, the president of Finland, who was Strobe's negotiating partner in that enterprise, did end up winning the Nobel Peace Prize, not only for Kosovo, for his role in Aceh in Indonesia and other peacekeeping efforts that he undertook. But in the U.S. side, Strobe was the driving force in that negotiation, more so even than Holbrooke, who had a role in that. Tori and Steve, you were both participants in all that. How would you both characterize that whole enterprise?
Let me connect it with the topic that we're discussing, which is NATO, because it's a reminder of how full of crises this period that we now remember as the holiday from history really was. Right. It wasn't that there was just this placid decade in which nothing really happened.
Right.
To the contrary, and I think that's very relevant to the way the United States thought about NATO. It wasn't that, well, the Cold War is over and we have this vestigial institution that we can't really think of any purpose for. It was instead, the Cold War is over, Europe looks like a cauldron of all kinds of problems, instability, whether it's Ukrainian nuclear weapons, suicidal nationalism in the Balkans, the possibility, which came up so often in, Clinton NSC meetings of, a dictator on horseback in Russia. And so that meant the idea of, transforming NATO into some way, mainly meaning weakening it or marginalizing it or replacing it with the OSCE, was just not anything that people seriously contemplated. The idea was NATO helped us win the Cold War. NATO is a tool that only a frivolous policymaker would think about abandoning at a time when it looks as though we've got a lot of other problems on our hands. That's not an answer about Kosovo, but maybe Toria will want to say a word about that. Although, in that period, Toria traveled with Strobe and I traveled with Madeline, and we would compare notes when we were back in Washington and try to figure out whether they were saying the same thing and whether we were really...
Something they both worried about.
They definitely did, and there were moments where they didn't agree.
And the problem was, though, in the Fourth Estate, there was a tendency, I wouldn't say totally unfair, to characterize this as Madeline's war and Strobe's peace.
The cover of Time magazine, yes.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's important to go back to Bosnia, where you'd had this rampaging war that Bill Clinton didn't want to get into. He finally gets into it. We get a peace that ends the war, but it doesn't actually settle the future of Bosnia. But from a U.S.-Russia point of view, the fact that the Russians participated in the peacekeeping effort, that they were within the mission that NATO and the U.S. ran, seemed miraculous. But part of the deal there was that they were supposed to keep Milosevic under control and his irredentism under control, and that didn't happen. On the contrary, when he goes rampaging across Kosovo and starts genociding again, they're like, oh, sure, Kosovo's always been part of Serbia and should be again. So. And then, of course, when we hit the Chinese embassy by mistake, it's Nelly bar the door in terms of... So that's really the first big split in terms of the strategic way we're thinking about Europe between Moscow and Washington. So Strobe's part of the job was to try to find a way to get the same kind of deal with the Russians. Come on, guys, it's not a good thing that all these people are getting dead. Milosevic is out of control. We need a settlement that you can live with and we can live with. Can we do the same thing again, where we have a shared peacekeeping mission when we come to an agreement? And you're part of the guarantee force for Milosevic to make peace. That was the goal. And we had the 50th anniversary of NATO in Washington in the spring of '99, and we could see the outlines of it. Bill and Boris meet. They agree that Strobe will be dispatched to try to figure this out. We set off on what became...
With Chernomyrdin representing the Russians.
Chernomyrdin, who of course had no power and was kind of a dolt anyway. Sorry, Chernomyrdin, but it's true. Anyway, it was again the Mamedov Strobe show to try to figure this thing out, and we embarked on what became an 8-week negotiation where we were shuttling back and forth Moscow, Helsinki, Brussels to talk to the NATO folks. And I was saying that I had 2 little kids then. I had a less than 1-year-old, and I had a 1-year-old and a 2.5-year-old, and I was on the road with Strobe from the Sunday to the Friday every week. We didn't know when it was going to end. I'd walk in the door, and my historian husband would say, "Here are your children," for the weekend until he had to take them back. But ultimately that one didn't go so well, and we're sitting in the Russian Defense Ministry at 3:00 in the morning trying to figure out where they're going to be positioned. And they are jumping into Pristina, and Sandy Berger is screaming at us down the phone. I think my cell phone was this big at that time.
Yeah, which also almost precipitated a divorce in the Edelman household, because you guys then had to show back up in Helsinki after I thought it was safe to go back in the water, and we were on our way to a family vacation, but never mind. We all survived.
Eric,
Steve.
I remember giving a talk at a Washington think tank in the course of the war where a lot of Washington think tankers were very distressed by the split between the United States and Russia over the war. And I said, look, What happens when a war like this starts is the Russians get off the bus.
Yeah.
The war ends, the Russians get back on the bus. And
Is that going to happen this time? I'm not so sure.
No.
Yeah.
No, sorry. No.
That was a different Russia.
Different war.
We're done. Although, and I think it's important because it was and Stephan's book makes this clear, it was felt to be a different kind of crisis with the Russians, and yet, at the end, you had the G8 foreign ministers,
right.
Agreeing that, yes, we endorse this plan. You had, a trio of diplomats going around Europe with the Russians represented at the former prime minister level, buying the deal.
Yep.
And that was a kind of picture of what European security was going to be like. The Russians were going to be off the bus at times, but you were going to be able to get them back on the bus. You were going to be able to get them back on the bus by using NATO, by being ready to use force in a way that the Russians did not like, but you were also going to be able to keep them at the table by showing that they had some kind of standing for their interests to be recognized. And that was ultimately a restatement of what the strategy in the 90s was.
Right.
The Russians are not going to like what the New World Order is, but we're going to find ways to make it seem advantageous for them.
And it was also a good move, I think, by Strobe and by the Clinton administration to use Ahtisaari and to use the European Union as a key participant in all of this, because that gave the Europeans a lot of agency, and so to use the Europeans as key interlocutors and key negotiators with the Russians.
Can I add one other thing now? I think it analytically got a lot of people, this is, I'm sorry to say, kind of true of a lot of this period. It gave people the idea that the Russian military was the problem, whereas in reality, the domestic political problem that was building in Russia was about the KGB.
Right.
And that has been the story of Russian political development since then. And, the Russian military, by contrast, they've been the tool that the KGB establishment used to advance their objectives, but they didn't set objectives.
In fact, they deployed with us again in Kosovo. The terms were slightly different, but the Russian military sort of thought it was kind of neat to be working side by side with us, and it was
side by side nothing, to be taking orders from us.
Well, but my point was that we were all learning from each other. And, the fact that Russia accepted that deal, we went back to the UN and all agreed on it. When you listen to Putin's narrative of grievance now, and it doesn't start with Kosovo, it starts in, 1637 or something, but nonetheless.
Well, that's only halfway back.
Kosovo's, a central part of it, but it
14th century.
It could have been a good deal for them. They could have sold it as we are integral. And this was part of it, by then, by 98, 99, you're starting to hear this, if we're not running our ancient lands, it's not good for us, versus the narrative we were trying to tell, which was, let's join hands and build this world together, and it'll be a win-win for you, and you'll get rich, just like Germany has. It wasn't enough for the Putins of this world because of their zero-sum upbringing.
But they were still prepared to play ball. The Russian financial crisis was just a year earlier,
right?
And they were, and the Chechen crisis was just months away.
And they needed our money
and
our help.
They needed our money and our help, and we were prepared to withhold it when we decided we didn't like what they were doing. So in the last year of the Clinton administration, we cut off IMF aid to the Russians because we said to them, you act the way you've done in Chechnya, we're not going to support you in the way that you have expected.
Right.
And that too was part of the strategy.
Right.
This was remember the Russia-centric policy of the Bill and Boris relationship. It was one where we're prepared to say our conception of what European security is like does not involve what you're doing.
What you're doing, yeah. I want to turn to questions from the audience, and then before we wrap up, I'm going to come back to all three of you kind of for a quick lightning round of what lesson you take, major lesson you take from the period under discussion for what we're facing today. We've got two questions that are sort of related. One was, why did this, just a perfect segue from Steve's last point about Chechnya, why did this kind of new conception of how to embrace the Russians in kind of European security architecture fail in the end of the day to prevent Russian aggression? And a kind of related question that's come in as well, which is, was there a way for the international community to have done more to prevent Russia's slide towards authoritarianism? Steve, I'm going to start with you and we can come down the row.
You know, at the end of the Clinton administration, I wrote an article that I didn't clear with the White House, and they were pissed about this because it came out after the election, but they did not like it. And I said that I thought the bigger problem, we face two problems in the future of Russia. One is neo-authoritarianism, and the other is neo-imperialism. And I said, for the foreseeable future, we've got more tools for dealing with neo-imperialism. We don't have such good tools for dealing with neo-authoritarianism. And we don't actually know how to use them. We'd already gotten some sense of what it was like in Putin's efforts to close down the press. We didn't get, I would say, a lot of buy-in from the rest of Europe for that point of view. I think the Europeans were maybe sort of satisfied with the idea that shutting off neo-imperialism was enough, and that we're going to disapprove of neo-authoritarianism, but they weren't going to do very much about it. And as I said in this article, our tools are limited. So the answer to your second question is, it was a tough one to handle, and in part because we were here actually kind of interested in Russian support. You know, in the early Bush administration, after 2000 and after September 11th, we were interested in the Russians being on our side and not making it difficult for us to support what we were doing in Afghanistan with overflights and base uses in Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan.
Correct. Yeah.
So that we got a little diverted from the question of, which would have been a hard one to address under any circumstances, to address neo-authoritarianism.
I would agree with that and say it was actually far worse than that, because when Putin comes in, he starts slowly, not so slowly, feels slow as compared to what we're seeing here now, but dismantling all of the sort of green shoot institutions of democracy that had started in the Yeltsin era. So obviously the free press, but then he goes after the titans of industry who might have enough economic power to ask for political power, whether it's Kuczynski, Khodorkovsky, Berezovsky, all these guys, starts locking them up, using the tax authorities, of course, Chechnya too, whatever's happening. And there was a decision made, and I remember arguing with a very senior Bush 43 administration official, she shall remain nameless, about what was happening inside Russia and the question of whether it mattered to us. And the answer was, they can do whatever they want inside their country. That's not our problem, as long as they are not an external threat. So we had the opportunity to meter out how much integration we offered, how much benefit from the relationship with us we offered, in exchange for staying basically democratic, which they were not doing. So the nature of the regime changed, and fast forward to today, And we didn't think that the nature of the regime mattered to us in terms of the business we were doing. Now, we screwed it up too, right? I mean, the first thing Bush 43 does is the ABM treaty, withdrawal, which, if Strobe had been in charge, we would have gone to Moscow and said, here's why this treaty doesn't work for us. Let's see if we can negotiate something else. We wouldn't have just ripped it up. And then when September 11th happens, and frankly, the Russians had been warning us for 4 or 5 years. How many meetings did we sit in where we said watch Iran, they said watch Afghanistan. Neither of us listened to each other at that time. But we wanted their background on the Taliban. We wanted intelligence sharing. That's what Putin promised. We started that. We didn't feel like we were getting much. They didn't feel like they were getting much. So there was sort of, the Russian word is разочарование, disappointment both ways. But that sort of also fed into Putin's narrative that we couldn't be trusted, and we shouldn't have trusted a country that was moving in the wrong direction.
Can
Steve,
I just add one
please.
thing to your first question about what we do now? I think it's important to understand the way in which, for all that the Russia account has gone badly, nevertheless, you have a European framework that is much more advantageous to us than it might have been with different policies, with ones that had tried to undermine NATO or disengage from questions of European security,
Or left the Central Europeans out on their own.
Yeah.
to the
grazing.
right, and with an opportunity for the Russians to make trouble there. I think all in all, with the things that we understood and the things that we didn't understand well, we've ended up with a European framework that is highly advantageous to us in a way that I can't miss an opportunity to take a dig at the current administration, that the current administration does not understand as such an advantage.
Absolutely.
He's in danger of pissing away.
Yeah.
Stephan, I want you to answer this question too, and I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit, because Steve said that our European partners were interested in containing neo-imperialism, not so much neo-authoritarianism. I think one could make that point even more sharply, as Sylvie Kaufmann of Le Monde has done in a book, which unfortunately not yet translated into English, but she was there in Moscow when Trish and I were serving there. But our European friends, I think have actually been the handmaidens of some of the authoritarian turn in Russia, with Gerhard Schroeder going on the board of Gazprom, the commitment of the German government to taming Russia through trade and making itself dependent on Russian energy, despite the fact that the Americans were constantly warning about this. Not just the Germans, by the way. There are others, including some of my Finnish friends, who have gone on the board of Nord Stream. I mean, there's a lot of blame to go around. But if you could comment on that.
Right. So Strobe, what struck me when I researched the book and when I saw Strobe's notes and memcons and the meetings with Putin over Kosovo and Chechnya and Moscow summit in 2000, is that Strobe clearly deciphered Putin's darker sides. Very early on, Strobe had a clear sense about the dangers of Putin in the future. That Putin and his cronies could run this place for decades to come. And European policymakers did not sufficiently understand that. The Germans didn't understand it, the French and others. Tony Blair was one of the first people to visit Vladimir Putin before he was even elected in March 2000. And Strobe had a clear understanding and kept warning his European interlocutors, but nobody was listening at the time. And it's also discussed between Schröder and Clinton at a time when Schröder in 2000 already makes the case for another special relationship between the Germans and the Russians. And Ostpolitik. And Clinton, Rapallo, and Clinton says, no, that's too fast. That's too fast because we are in such an important transition period. Let's first see how this thing develops in the years to come. And Strobe is at a G7 meeting in July of 2000, and certainly he feels isolated among his Western colleagues because everybody's keen to conclude new trade deals with the Russian side. So this is in the last chapter of my book, his keen sense of Putin, and we were mentioning it in the email exchange before last week when we discussed it. Toria and Steve and Eric and Toria, you were present at that meeting, first meeting with Putin. What was that like over Kosovo?
So Putin, I can't remember if he was National Security Advisor or if he was already Prime Minister. I think he was National Security Advisor. But he had his cards, which he later never would show note cards, because he'd memorized the brief. And Strobe was trying to create a relationship. He was trying to get him to have a relationship with Sandy Berger, the whole deal. And Putin was very sort of cold and robotic. And I thought either it was his KGB nature, because it was very un-Russian. There was no humor, there was no human warmth at all. But then I thought maybe, he wasn't as confident in his briefs, so he wasn't going to show a lot. And then he does this very KGB thing, which is in Strobe's notes, where Strobe had at Oxford studied the Russian poet Tuchev. And at one point in the meeting, which was conducted in Russian, or at least Putin was speaking Russian, I think maybe we were speaking English, I can't remember, Strobe was, he starts quoting some Tuchev quote to Strobe, which basically implies, trust has to be earned. So it was a message to Strobe, I've got you decoded, and Strobe just was very gracious in the meeting, but afterwards said, this guy has not and will not change his spots.
Steve?
Okay, I need to tell a Putin story, which is Putin's first meeting with Clinton, which is in Auckland in the fall of 1999, when he's just been appointed prime minister.
Right.
And he comes in and he does the KGB thing that you described, Toria, showing I've read the file. And he said, I've always thought of you, Mr. President, as really a great friend of Russia. And I think that the reason for that is you used to be a staffer for Senator Fulbright. Clinton was completely befuddled. Senator Fulbright is nobody, and I'm the Russia hand. And he said, he didn't say, but what he meant was, you've really misunderstood. You've misunderstood the folder. But then by the end, Clinton actually liked him, and he said, he said to us afterwards, I really like him. He's so Russian. Meaning he didn't understand that the robotic part of it was Putin's attempt to be German. He wanted to. Stephan, apologies, but that's what Putin was doing. He was trying to be the hyper-competent, successor to Yeltsin, who
In control.
Not
drunk.
Not drunk, right?
Not drunk. And Putin didn't entirely get it. Strobe did.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. We've run out of time.
Great EQ, though.
I will just confirm Strobe's prescience in diagnosing Putin, because I remember coming back from Helsinki, meeting with Strobe in the early part of 2000, and he and I were comparing notes on the very long interview that Putin gave in Russian to Kommersant, I think it was Kommersant, which was then translated and edited and was published in the United States as first person. It was basically Putin's campaign biography for the March 2000 election. And Strobe and I comparing notes about how off-key it was in Putin's description, for instance, of the Stalin period and his own family's experience of the Stalin period, and how at variance it was with almost every Russian we'd ever talked to in terms of their experience. Because it's very hard to find anybody in Russia who, when you scratch a little bit, doesn't turn out to have somebody in the family who was touched by what happened in the 30s and 40s in Russia. With that, we'll have to wrap this up. I think we could probably go on for another couple of hours. But I want to thank the panel for being such a great panel to work with, and I hope the audience feels the same way about what we've done today.